Years ago, when I had my awakening, I went through a dark night of the soul. My life was falling apart. I was riddled with anxiety. I was certain I had ruined my life. I was very worried about the future. So, what did I do? I went to a therapist. I found somebody to work with. And at the same time, I started to experience all sorts of connections with healers, mediums, spiritual teachers of all different traditions. And so I was on this parallel course. On the one hand, going to therapy, and the other hand, awakening spiritually. And now I see time and again that people come to me for readings and they're similarly really anxious, overwhelmed with depression, mired in regret, or dealing with a very deep old trauma. And so something that comes up time and again in readings is, when do you need to go to therapy? And when is the spiritual work that you're doing the right modality for you? Now, I am not a therapist. I make that very clear in my readings. And some of you are going to have different opinions, and I welcome them. What's the first difference? Let me tell you one of the most important healing stories I experienced during this time period. I was really anxious. I was talking with a friend, and he said, "You should go get a hug from Amma, the hugging saint." I had never heard of Amma, so I said, "Okay, what have I got to lose?" So I go see Amma. And from the moment she walks in, I am overwhelmed with a sense of love and peace. My eyes are teared up. I had never met this person, and I've never since met anyone who exuded the kind of unconditional love that I felt from this person. She really embodied Divine Mother. And when I finally got my hug, I broke down sobbing, heaving, 15 seconds. And then I am filled with this incredible, blissful energy, just in a stupor for 20 minutes. I never experienced anything like it. And then I went back to being normal, anxious Patrick. And I went to my therapist and we're talking. And I realized that the two different approaches here fundamentally involved some significant differences in how you think about the self, the nature of the self, how you think about healing. In both cases, there's an exchange of energy. In one, there were no words. It's literally just being hugged and this transference of energy that I'd never experienced before, but which can happen in a lot of healing modalities. In the second, there's an exchange of energy through words. I'm telling my stories. I'm relaying how I feel. I'm getting questions and I'm responding to that. I'm being seen and heard, listened to. This is the first fundamental difference between therapy and spirituality. In therapy, a lot of the processing happens through the analysis of words. We tell stories, right? And we're trying to get to the feelings. We're describing them and we're explaining and analyzing, and perhaps we have an insight. We begin to see a pattern in our lives. We come to understand where certain beliefs and feelings came from. This is very important work. And the idea is that you have this crucible within which to do this work because you can't do it on your own without feeling overwhelmed. And in the realm of spirituality, all of my healing experiences, my most important healing experiences, have not come from putting things into stories at first, but from just experiencing the energy of the emotions, the sensations. And whether that's been my hug from Amma, Kundalini awakenings, healing from other energy healers, working with plant medicine, being on ayahuasca, or even simply feeling the emotions and then allowing them to move through me, what might commonly be known as mindfulness, all of these things were ways of simply experiencing the movement of emotional energy through me and then being released and turned into something else. And very often, as that energy moved, after that energy moved, then I could relate to it as a story. I could understand, or I could begin to inquire, where did this energy come from? Ah, this point in my childhood. Or I could understand, this energy actually was from a past life. not this life. Or there might not be a story at all. It just moved. One of my most powerful healing experiences was releasing a very deep fear of the supernatural that I acquired when I was a kid, and I saw a lot of very scary movies. I had been on a meditation retreat, and I had sat for many days, and finally, out of nowhere, I woke up in the middle of the night, filled with this fear that I had felt since childhood. And all I could do was feel it for 2 hours, sweating buckets. I was heaving. I was having almost like a panic attack, but I had the mental fortitude because I had been doing so much work for so many years to allow those feelings to come out and just experience them and then release them. It wasn't through talking about the story. So that's one of the fundamental differences. Healing is different. It involves moving energy in a different way. Sometimes talking is necessary just to get a handle on it and to feel heard and seen. There's power in that. You're borrowing the presence of somebody else when you haven't yet developed the capacity to be present to your own emotions, which is what the spiritual path teaches you. From there, I realized that fundamentally, how therapy thinks of the self and the self that I have come to understand in spirituality are very different. In therapy, I was treated as somebody with a conventional psychological set of issues. There were anxieties, maybe neuroses, depression, that you get labeled with a kind of diagnosis, and then you explore those feelings, trying to understand where they're coming from. And trauma work has obviously deeply complicated and enriched therapeutic modes of thinking about the self. But importantly, in therapy, I was coming at the world from a very wounded place. I could not disidentify from my feelings. I had no space around my feelings. I couldn't manage them. They overwhelmed me. And so I needed that space to be able to step away, to process them enough to get my arms around them. I was really struggling from day to day. So you might think of that as the wounded ego being led back to a state of a healthy ego. And at the same time that I'm on then this spiritual journey, I'm having all sorts of mystical experiences, all sorts of energetic experiences, touching this state of unbelievable, unconditional love. Realizing that the world around me that I had thought I understood was so much richer, deeper, the unseen, unmanifest world, that I had guides. I had spirit guides. I could connect to them. I had a soul. And then later, when I started to channel and do readings, realizing that myself was a much more multidimensional being than I believed. In essence, the passage was from therapy to healthy ego, and from healthy ego to transcendence. In other words, what I realized is that the spiritual path was teaching me to transcend the ego that my therapy work was getting me to. And I realized that a lot of the spiritual work really only happened once I got to a very healthy baseline. It is very hard if you are overwhelmed with anxiety, deep in depression, embittered and enraged with regret, or simply frozen in a traumatic state, to do the kind of work of transcendence that the spiritual path calls for. Because for the wounded ego, that kind of ego dissolution and death will feel like more wounding. It will feel like trauma. So you need therapy at times to get to a baseline where you can be and hold a stable container for the exploration of your emotions. To do the kind of work that I described when my supernatural fears showed up. In therapy, we're often talking about stories around our parents. There's this very funny moment in Kimmy Schmidt when Tina Fey plays a therapist who by day is normal and by night is completely out of control. And one day she gives into the out of control state, and Kimmy Schmidt meets her at a mall. And in the mall, she's given up. She's given over to her shadow side. She's slurping she's drinking this spiked Slurpee, and she turns to Kimmy and she says in this sort of drunken voice, "It's always the parents, Kimmy. It's always the parents." And in therapy and in spirituality, in readings, I often encounter that in fact it is often about the parents. Very often there are issues with mom and dad that show up right away in a reading. Sometimes the work of therapy and spirituality resemble each other in this regard. And you can learn from therapy the capacity to do the kind of inquiry that you would do with a therapist. Now, in my experience in therapy, very often therapist asks you what you think and your attitudes about your mom, and you're getting to feelings. Maybe you get to an insight. Maybe you understand why you're behaving. You're like, oh, I got this from my mother. Or I'm trying to accept that this is the way my mother was. And spirituality says, okay, we can heal that, remove that energy, and you're going to undo it because you're going to unwind the belief system that you got. Because you're going to understand that there's a reason that you chose your parents. So spirituality asks a different question, I think, than therapy asks when it comes to our parents. Because spirituality says this isn't about just your parents. It's about you and your soul and the entire lineage that you came through. You chose your parents on a soul level. And then it becomes a question of why. Why did you choose your parents? And so it becomes a very different story. If in therapy you're talking about the story of how your mother was, how your father was, why it upset you, why it upsets you still, spirituality says you took them on. You took that on for a purpose, and now you can unwind and heal that purpose. And in the future videos, I'm going to talk about how spirituality goes about healing sort of belief systems and wounds that we've received from our parents. It's different from the way therapists do inner child work. But at the end of the day, the fundamental thing is that we have a different understanding of the story. And it's a story of empowerment, not victimization. In therapy, you're often just dealing with the fact that this is the mom I got. This is the dad I got. And they had their limitations and they had their wounds. And they couldn't do any better. All very true. Now tell a story why your soul picked them. And when you tell that story, your relationship to having parents who treated you in a certain way becomes very different. It's much more powerful. And that leads to a fundamental final difference between them, which has to do, again, with the notion of the self. And that leads to a final difference, which is very powerful. And it has to do with power. Because in therapy, you're there to get a handle on your life. You're coming there, obviously, from a very disempowered place. And you're learning to draw boundaries, you're learning to manage emotions, and you're developing new coping mechanisms. And spirituality says you are the creator of your entire life and everything in it. Now, that's a perfect example of the kind of lesson that the wounded ego can't handle. Because you can imagine that if you walked in and said, I'm overwhelmed, we said, well, you're creating this, it's your responsibility. That would feel like blame. But from a healthy ego standpoint, what spirituality is saying is you literally are the creator of your life through your perceptions, your thoughts, beliefs, your identity. How you meet the world is your perception. Talked about this in the last video when it came to oneness. You are your perception of the world. And so everything that you're experiencing is your perception. Everything that you experience is your responsibility. So whenever anybody upsets you, hurts you, wounds you, now, as an adult, that is your responsibility. Your ability to create an unmovable consciousness that cannot be disturbed. This is something that's talked a lot about in Buddhist tradition, that sense of solidity, that the consciousness can't be disturbed. Your mind is not going to be affected by these things. That takes a lot of effort, but it is the power that belongs in each and every one of us. The power to create our life from moment to moment, and to do so in a way that embodies love, compassion, and joy. That's ultimately what we're here to do. We're here to embody the kind of love I felt from Amma in that hug. That is what each and every one of us is capable of. Whether we actually accomplish that or not is irrelevant. We all are connected to that source because we're all connected to the divine. And from moment to moment, your emotions are fluctuating, and you have to let that energy go. You have to let that energy move through you, and then you examine and figure out, why am I feeling this way? Ah, I believe this. Why do I believe this? Why do I need to believe that? I no longer need to believe that. I choose a new thought. I choose a new belief. Your power to create yourself and then recreate yourself in the moment. And that is the power that we all have. This is what is meant by transcendence, ascension, enlightenment. When you're in that place, you meet the moment with full presence, with complete love. You are unmovable in the sense that you aren't going to react with fear. You're not going to react with anger. Does that always happen? No, this is part of the path. You're going to have moments where you fall out, you figure out why, and you come back to the state of balance. It is all about meeting this moment with complete and total acceptance, no resistance. All of the emotions, the negative emotions, fear, resentment, anxiety, all forms of resistance to the present moment, based on the thoughts and beliefs you have about what is happening, about how you perceive this. And the deeper you go on the path, the more and more you surrender, accept, and love what is happening right in front of you in this very moment. It's the power, choice, how you meet that moment. It's what you're training yourself to do. Now, when is therapy important? I've already alluded to the fact that therapy can be very helpful and is critical for when you're dealing with very overwhelming emotions, when you do not have the capacity to feel your emotions and not be overwhelmed, and to not identify with them. And so therapy can be really critical for getting to a certain baseline. That doesn't mean that therapy is only an adjunct to spirituality, like a stage. First you go through therapy and then you turn to spirituality. But they differ in their end goals. The goal of therapy is to get you to be able to manage your life in a healthy way without necessarily repeating patterns that create a lot of pain and suffering for you. Spirituality takes you to another level in relating to this world. But that doesn't mean therapy isn't still relevant. And one of the things that happens is people bypass their pain. They use spirituality as a short circuit, or they dress up old patterns in spiritual garb. I want to give you an example. This comes up a lot in readings. People struggle with relationships. Relationships are hard. They are. They require a lot of work. But I meet a lot of people who, on a spiritual path, avoid the difficulties of conflict or the hard work of repairing a connection by resorting to spiritual language. They withdraw from a relationship. Oh, we're not vibrating at the same frequency anymore. Or they justify they're not part of my tribe. And some relationships will end, absolutely, because you'll be very different people on different paths, and the reasons that you were brought together no longer hold true. But in a lot of cases, people are avoiding the discomfort that is inherent in human relationships. So also happens when people simply start to avoid a connection, avoid intimacy by saying, I'm focusing on my inner world. And that's becoming a means of avoiding human connection. And in that sense, therapy can be really valuable at helping you to see patterns in your life that you are actually masquerading as spiritual wisdom. In some cases, the choices you make will be valid. In other cases, they're old patterns that are hiding from you and using spirituality as a disguise. Spirituality is ultimately about recognizing that you are you. This construct, the self, is an illusory construct. What you think of yourself, the history in a body, is your current construct. You tell a story about who you are. When that is filled with pain and suffering, you may need to talk through so that you can process that, particularly if you're not adept at self inquiry. Spirituality says, I get to reconstruct myself from moment to moment. I am both a time bound being in a body that will die, and I'm a timeless energy, a soul. And when I connect with that, I realize that my core is this unconditional love. And my path is to learn to live from that place and to meet the moment with unconditional love. Therapy can help you get to the baseline where you can do the work of unwinding the pieces of you that no longer serve that relationship between you and your soul. Stuff that you've inherited from your parents, traumatic events, etc. And that work will continue on spirituality when you've developed a stable enough container that you can look at your past honestly, clearly, and not be overwhelmed by it. Because our shadow sides are really good at hiding from us. And that's why this process is endless. It's never ending. So I hope I hope this helps clarify at least how I see the difference between spirituality and therapy. So in the next episode, I'm going to be talking about one of my all-time favorite topics, emotions. Where are they? What do they serve? How do we use them? How do we feel them? What does it mean to let go? So stay tuned for more.